Good morning, viewers. The International Monetary Fund is expected to meet on Tuesday to recommend the approval of Nigeria's request for $3.45 billion. This is part of Nigeria's strategy to get sustainability in this period of the COVID-19 pandemic. The loan, which is scheduled to look at areas in which Nigeria can begin to revigorate its economy amidst the challenging pandemic period, will also be of top discussions amongst the board of IMF when they meet on Tuesday. According to Bloomberg, the meeting will also look at other issues in the request and how Nigeria can really get assistance in this period. Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Mrs. Zainab Ahmed, has made serious case around this and believes that this assistance from multilateral organizations to the country will help to sustain the battle against the pandemic. And now today we go on to our economy and politics show and discussions. Today we have in our midst and joining us today, Professor of Political Economy, Professor Pat Utomi. Nice to have you, sir, this morning.
It's a pleasure to join you.
We will be discussing financing Nigeria's way through COVID-19, particularly the need to restructure a new economy. It's always great to have you, Prof. I know that you have a very busy schedule, and thank you for joining us today on Economy and Politics Economics Discourse.
Glad I could.
Yes. This is lockdown phase 2, and it's the last day of this lockdown phase 2 in Lagos, Abuja, and Ogun, alongside other states that have taken measures to place the lockdown to mitigate the risk of COVID-19. How has the experience been, Prof, for you?
Well, it's been mixed in a manner of speaking. I think that when people are not working and producing, it always creates a certain level of anxiety. But in a very strange way, and I hate to say this in public because it might upset some people whose routines are different, this has been amongst my productive weeks. I actually went on lockdown about 9-10 days before the formal government lockdown. So I've been on lockdown. I've been away from the office for more than a month already. Because I recognized how the pandemic was evolving and I knew the importance of social distancing. I realized that if we didn't do the needful, we could get ourselves into a huge nightmare. We don't have the resources to struggle the way Italy with the resources has struggled. And so it was important to me that prevention was far better than cure. But at the same time, I recognized the challenge, especially for people who have to get out of their homes every day to be able to get some income to get by that same day. As someone who essentially can produce just about anywhere he's located, it turned out personally for me to be a huge blessing in disguise because it stopped the flow at first, I think, of disturbing calls and visits. And so I could concentrate on the books that I was working on. So it was an enormously productive season. But suddenly the webinars have taken over and I can't seem to get a rest. Every 30 minutes or so, somebody calls you that, oh, this webinar, can you please? So that one has become a new nuisance in a manner of speaking. But in some ways fulfilling because you see after speaking to a group how the scales drop from their eyes, so to speak, and you feel fulfilled by it. Other than that, clearly the lockdown period has raised conversations that I think are important for the future of our country, the future of this economy. There are people who say that, if they are at home, they cannot eat. So perhaps they should just as well die trying to get something to eat than die of hunger at home. I mean, a logical way to look at things, but I also try to remind people of the history of pandemics. I think that part of our challenge is that we don't read enough history to understand that pandemics have shaped human history. In many, many ways, the way economies have evolved. And that's why, again, Angus Deaton's book, The Great Escape, Health, Wealth, and the Origins of Inequality, is a good read. I mean, he doesn't write about pandemics, but he writes about the importance of health in economic development. Of course, Angus Deaton won the 2015 Nobel Prize in Economics from his work. But I think even more importantly, for people interested in economic history, if you read people like Jared Diamond, who look at the evolution, literally, of the human race, of millions and thousands of years, particularly the last 16 or so thousand years of human civilization, you will see that after man went from the hunter-gatherer to the herder farmer, the challenge of domesticating wild animals for food production became the touch-off of the many pandemics that we're dealing with till today. That contact between man and animal led to this effect of diseases that threaten to wipe out man, actually. People forget that the bubonic plague, the so-called Black Death, only about 300 and something years ago wiped out 1/4 of the population of Europe. And that the so-called European conquest of the Americas was not so much the function of firepower, as Western historians like to make it out, but really a function of disease transmission. And Jared Diamond, in the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, does a more outstanding work of historic documentation when he makes the simple point that when Cortez, for example, arrived in Latin America, we can say the same thing for Columbus. Cortez had a shipload of 600 and something people. They couldn't have, between them, no matter how much firepower they had, conquer millions in a warrior civilization like the Aztec civilization. The same thing with the Incas, further south. What basically happened was that in their interacting with the natives that they met in America, measles, smallpox, which they had become immune to after the pandemics in Europe, infected the local population and wiped out 99% of the Native Americans. That's how the white man took over the Americas, not because of firepower. So pandemics have had a significant way of shaping economic history. And the last well-known one, the Spanish influenza of 1918-19, which was felt in our parts. In fact, if you go to my hometown and many villages in Nigeria till today, they still, in the dating, you'll be here of the age grade of the great influenza, those born in the 1918-19 season, because it had impact even here. Took out 21 million people by some accounts in Europe and 50 million worldwide. And they shape economies. These pandemics all shape economies. This particular pandemic is seen, not necessarily as taking out more the older, less productive people, but the influenza took out more of the working age people. So its consequence for work in that age was very significant. And as we can see from this particular pandemic, its consequence for how we work will be significant as we have entered the fourth industrial revolution. And we're going to be depending more on artificial intelligence and all of that for how we work. We will see that this lockdown of the planet will lead to a significant shifting in how man works, reliance more on artificial intelligence, and less of the gathering in the office kind of routine. But let me leave that as a subject I like to talk about. But yeah, I know that you want to talk about finance this morning.
Okay. I mean, it's good to get a history of the pandemics and how they've shaped economies. At least the last, like you said, the Spanish influenza of 1918 to 1919 had its impact on the global economy. Even the numbers that you've mentioned there quite massive, 50 million at that time globally. But let's look also at measures to mitigate the pandemic and also respond via policy. I know that your economic philosophy, you've always made a strong case for the vulnerable and the poor to be included, to feel the impact of policy so that they're not left out and does not become a crisis or social crisis or contagion. So far, how do you assess the policy response during the lockdown in terms of fiscal measures to address the challenges of Nigerians amidst the lockdown and amidst the pandemic?
Well, I think that's something we should have anticipated somehow caught us by surprise, which is really the tragedy of the Nigerian leadership experience. Anticipated for a variety of reasons. First of all, we had the Ebola knock on our door, which should have reminded us that, epidemics are always lurking. We're still dealing with the issues of Lassa fever and all of that. We, at the global level, saw the avian flu, saw SARS, and all of that come and go. Somehow we developed this sense that these things are not Nigerian diseases, they just come somewhere else, they go from there. George W. Bush, as President of the United States, made a great speech on the coming of pandemics and how America should prepare for it. And he began to set up a system within the American governmental apparatus for responding to pandemics. Barack Obama
Prof, can you hear me?
In fact, by way of irony,
okay,
in which he said, like in 5 years, if this hits us, came exactly 5 years to the day it became a major issue in New York last month, as one journalist pointed out. So with all of these things around the world, it's incredible to realize that one of Nigeria's biggest failings is to recognize the importance of its healthcare sector. Most modern development, in fact, modernity and human progress has been denominated on two major factors, education and healthcare. And that is really the essence of Angus Deaton's The Great Escape. Progress and what has led to great inequality between nations has been a function of those who have managed their healthcare. You can imagine how I felt when my friend, the SGF boss Mustafa, said that he didn't realize our health system was as bad as it is. I can tell you about 15 years or so ago, I went to the Shagamu campus of the Ogun State University, Onabanjo University as it is called now, to give a talk. The talk was preceded, it was about CVL, the Center for Values in Leadership. There's a youth, a CVL club set up on that a talk. And just before me speaking, it was a professor, I think Professor Funshaw, who was then in the talk he gave, his last words I never forget is the Nigerian healthcare system is a man-made disaster. And to think that we would just observe these things and spend the kind of monies we spend wastefully on all kinds of frivolities in the Nigerian economy is for me a national tragedy. As Patrick Okibo nicely wrote, after this pandemic broke, there's nowhere to run to. So the big men are caught in Nigeria. The private jets won't be allowed to land if they tried to in Europe and all of that. And so all that money that's been stashed away really becomes meaningless. Now, the majority of the population obviously need to survive a season like this. And there should be planning to take care of how that happens. Again, we can see that the planning hasn't been the best. It's almost resulted in social combustion. Indeed, Farid Zakaria had predicted a few weeks ago that the pandemic would likely lead to revolution in some countries like Nigeria. And we began to see the taste of it in the social revolts around the place. But what is clear is that we have not devised a proper system of incentivizing the people. If we say that we have a social register that has 2.6 million people, and we up it by 1 million people, my first question is, how are we generating this social register? The second thing is, what is 3.6 million in a country where more than 100 million people live below the poverty line? So you see that we're just scratching surfaces to be seen to be doing something, and not because we expect that those will have deep impact. And then the question is, where's the money coming from? We don't have money. I mean, I have been, what's the right word now, very clear in my head that we can find the money. And we can find the money by shutting down the frivolities. We're in a national emergency, a moral equivalence of a war. So we can take wartime kind of decisions, even though the selfishness of the political class is getting in the way of that. We can shut down the National Assembly for the next one year and take the resources that they consume and keep the poor at home for 2-3 months and ensure that this thing passes us by without doing to us what the smallpox and measles did to the Native Americans. Because if we are not careful, this thing has the capability of decimating our population. I've seen anger going around that suggestions from out of WHO that this thing could take out a couple of 100,000 people from Africa and all of that. But think about it this way, it can be much worse. I mean, look what has happened in Kano in a few days. I am not so sure what the details are, but it just shows you how much worse it can actually be. And there are many people who are projecting that we've not got there in the curve, that we probably might be getting there around June, July. God forbid that that is the case. Then we'll realize that we needed to have taken more drastic kinds of measures in terms of the so-called palliatives for the weakest and the poorest. Thank God that our human solidarity nature is leading to a lot of private people reaching out to relatives, townsmen, and doing all kinds of things to support. That has been helpful. But clearly, we needed a better fiscal order to be able to stimulate things. But a warning is important here. While it's important to ensure that the weakest of our society, the most vulnerable, are helped through this season, there is also the danger we must be very careful of not making them dependent on handouts. Because it's very easy to get into this handout culture. We already have an entitlement mentality in this country caused by the oil economy and the economic rents that people have extracted from it. This entitlement mentality, it can lead to people becoming inoculated from the essence of being, which is production. You produce your way out of poverty. You don't get handouts to take you out of poverty. And so the balance is a very delicate one that we need to work with and provide incentives for those people to produce rather than to give them to survive. I think this is very important because the worst that can happen is that we get the lottery effect. You know, the lottery effect when a poor man wins the lottery, lots of money, And 10 years later, you go and check him out, he's worse than he was before you won the lottery. I think we must avoid the lottery in the kinds of approaches we take to providing these new fiscal incentives for people to help escape this lockdown season. The truth of the matter, let's face it frontally, is that Nigeria faces what I like to describe as the triple shock challenge. There are three shocks coming to Nigeria at the same time right now. Well, the first shock that is obvious and visible and that is blamed for everything is the shutdown or lockdown, people not going to work because of the COVID-19 virus. The second shock is coming from oil price collapse, literal collapse. And the third shock, which came first, and see, there's a way people like to pretend that these problems are COVID-19 based. The Nigerian economy was literally in free fall before COVID-19. It came from a perception that Nigeria was not good for investment. We all saw Forbes late last year do, I guess, what was more like an editorial. Nigeria was the easiest place to lose money, which is a nature of the kind of private property is organized in Nigeria. In public, my 1998 book, Managing Uncertainty, I described as the overact of predatory acts of public officials. So we were in a deep crisis. So that one shock, put on top of it the shock of COVID-19 lockdown and the shock of collapsed oil prices, means that Nigeria needs to completely rethink its economy if we are going to be going anywhere.
So I hear you say we should rethink our economy. You've made some very bold proposals, particularly about the National Assembly and also at the need.
But not just National Assembly. If National Assembly is going to go down for 1 year, the executive branch must cut its expenditure by 60%.
Mm. Well, your friends in National Assembly, I know they will react to this.
Several times I want them to react. Yes, our country must have a debate on this.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's an economy that must have constant debate because it's about the citizens and it's about effective governance. Looking at what some of the things you've said, we've had some interventions. We've seen the Central Bank of Nigeria from the monetary side roll out 50 billion naira, and already we have seen 80,000 applications from businesses to assess that through NISAL. We've also seen measures that the CBN is looking at Infraco PLC, a vehicle that can help transportation infrastructure in the country, and that's through a debt and equity model. And also we are looking at the government coming up with strategies from the Economic Sustainability Committee chaired by the Vice President. They say they will bring out the document very soon, and they've been meeting with multilateral agencies like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. What do you expect to see in terms of strategies at this point? In top 3-5 areas that you need to be quickly addressed in terms of our policy options at this time. They are limited for the fiscal side and even from the monetary side, but what are those top 5 areas you need to be addressed at this point?
Well, I think first of all, we need a clear national strategy. It's okay to run all over the place and put this in place, that in place. If they are not cohesive and pointed at a certain goal, it will still come to the kind of experiences we have had in the past. What do I mean by a clear national strategy? You see, the great debates about what leads to economic growth have been hinged for generations now around perceptions about which general strategy is best. Laissez-faire, the big idea that trade race to wealth. Comes straight out of Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, which has been the Bible of liberal Western capitalism in the Anglo-Saxon, that is UK American tradition, and has dominated how we see creating national wealth or creating wealth. And the much ignored but out of light, out of sight option offered way back in Adam Smith's time or shortly after Adam Smith by the German Friedrich List, which basically talks about national strategies, national development strategies rather than laissez-faire. In many ways, the strategy that the Asian tigers adopted, which led to their leapfrogging stages of development, the South Koreas of this world, the Hong Kongs, Thailand, and co, has taken more the approach of the least perspective and has led to the kind of growth that we have called economic miracles. Now, that approach has been underpinned by industrial policy. Industrial policy, therefore, is one that says, where do we want to be? What value chains, let's say, we would like to dominate as an economy? And what do we put in place to be able to dominate those value chains? My thesis, and there, again, within even that tradition, there are many perspectives. There is a perspective, there's a wholesale perspective offered by the South Korean-born Cambridge economist Jeju Chang, who wrote the book, The Bad Samaritans. On the other hand, he cites, of course, South Korea's use of industrial policy and discriminatory tariffs and all of that to protect sectors to make them rise. On the other hand, we know that the import substitution industrialization strategy, which tried to protect also in a wholesale manner, left us with permanent infant industries. I figure the tradition in structural economics that actually does look at specific endowments. And we say, look, Nigeria has endowments in the production of, let us say, cassava, sesame seed, plantain. What do we do to dominate global value chains, become globally competitive, and therefore not depend on protection beyond, say, 1, 2, 3 years or 4, that kind of thing, to get that sector running, giving massive inputs, focusing on that sector. And then when that sector begins to fly, we just leave them to compete globally because they have the strength to compete in that area. So we don't get into this permanent infant industry thing. In a manner of speaking, that perspective was picked up on by Justin Lin. Justin Lin is the Chinese economist who served at the World Bank as vice president and chief economist for a brief period. And Lin essentially talks about the idea of latent comparative advantage. And therefore, that as the basis for advancing the economic goals of countries at a disadvantaged position. And my view would be that we identify some value chains and say, look, these value chains are where we're going to play. Appoint a champion or champions or whatever with clear timelines and goals to achieve in those value chains, and marshal resources to support they are trying to achieve those things. Unless we do it, we're going to put out 550 billion. 1 million applications will come from NICEL, from people who are just trying to see if they can extract some rent from the fact that government is making something available. It leads me back to my critique of the banking industry. The Nigerian banking industry is not development oriented. Nigerian banking industry, and this is a painful thing for me personally, because I know the fights that some of us fought for the Nigerian banking industry to emerge as it is today. Way back in the early 80s, banking in Nigeria was essentially the domain of multinational banks and government-owned banks. Because the banking crisis of 1922 and of the 1950s led to, basic position in the enactment of the 1959 Banking Ordinance, which basically made barriers to entry into banking so high that it was only like governments and foreign multinational banks that could play. But this created an oligopoly that made banking very inefficient, the famous tally number era and all of that. And so in the early 80s, many of us began to fight that it was important to lower barriers to entry into banking. And we gave lots and lots of talks. I remember, I can still probably go back to some of those talks. With the structural adjustment program, and this is why the moment to, again, maybe pay tribute to somebody I'm told passed away in Kanu last week, Ibrahim Ayagi. Professor Ayagi was then managing director of Continental Merchant Bank, so the Chase Merchant Bank. And we were both involved in these massive debates about the direction the Nigerian economy should take during the mid-80s. And part of my argument is that if we lowered barriers to entry into banking, we would create an entrepreneurial banking industry that could then fund growth and development, different from the kind of banking industry that we had, where policy was forcing banks to do rural banking and Greek lending, and all of those were being shortchanged in one way or the other. Unfortunately, that acceptance of those ideas, which led to lowering banking barriers into banking around 1986, created all these banks we now have and know. Nice, and I was very proud to see those developing. Before those days, it was said that if you went to school, banks did not hire you. I still remember Chief Ogunigwe, S. Ogunigwe of Prudent Merchant Bank, saying in a class in 1994 that he was the first graduate hired in Nigerian banking. It used to be thought that, if you are going to be hired in banking, it was a routine kind of work, carrying ledger from this place to the other. You didn't need too much of a brain. So the standard qualification was G4, as they call it in those days. That those who didn't pass school start. If you had grade 1 in school start, banks were reluctant to hire you because they thought you would go off to university sometime soon. Now, the change led to entrepreneurial banks, like I said. But what has happened is that the bankers became big stuff guys in their fancy ties, fancy cars, motorcades for the executives, and all of that. And they missed the point of economic development. So they would extract rent. They would fund those who are importing petrol, which is really a dubious business area, and all of that. But they would not fund real businesses that involve work. These people are owing. You don't even ask who is owing for what reason. Most of the debtors in Nigeria are people who did work for government. The government did not pay. I say, no, these people. Then you take away the entrepreneurial people from being able to access finance, instead of creating young bankers who will understand an area of business. Take it strong. I'm a believer, and forget about what people say about the Chebols and the Keretsus and interlocking directorates. I think that if banks and created a structure where they were represented on the boards, and governance is a very important thing, on the boards of these businesses, and laid less emphasis on how many buildings the person will bring as collateral. You looked at character, and then you had representation on those boards and ensured that the business plan was going in a direction. You would achieve a lot more to expand the economy in areas that we needed to ensure that capital goes into. Unfortunately, this has not been the approach that we have had to banking. Instead, what we hear are ethical issues where, unless the personal interests of executives were involved, resources don't flow there, and so on and so forth. So part of what we need to get out of this mess is to create a new kind of financial system away from this current banking system. Yes, the banking system may have its use. Maybe we need to create a new commercial development banking. Again, let me turn to studies of these things that have been done in the past. A former chief economist of the IMF was a professor at the University of Chicago and later became governor of the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank, Raghuram Rajan, and one of his colleagues, Luigi Zingales, wrote a remarkable book years ago. It was titled Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists. Raghu Rajan and Luigi Zingales argue in that book that one of the economies that's most able to renew itself in the world is the American economy. And that part of the reason that happens is that there are institutional arrangements that make it easy for a bright young who has a business idea to be able to access capital outside of the traditional financing system. But that was less so in Europe, and even far less so in the so-called developing countries of Asia and Africa. So that a young man who, in the US, has a radical idea about an area where value could be created, but has no asset whatsoever, could approach a fund. And there's so many of those kinds of funds in America. There's a vulture fund. A vulture fund allows an entrepreneur to access money to look for dying businesses, like the vulture. The vulture is a patient bird hovering and acquires to turn around. There are all kinds of funds in the US. And I give an example of one that I was at Wharton many years ago, and I was talking with Ian McDonald. Ian was director of the C. Snyder Center for Entrepreneurship at Wharton. Ian is in South Africa. He tells the story of one of the former students who was looking to find a business to run. He didn't even know what business he wanted to run. He was trying to find one. Now, in the US, you have such a thing as a search fund. Because he is a Wharton alum, just because of the school he went to. He has an MBA from Wharton. That's because he's collateral security. He could approach a fund. He doesn't even know what to do yet, but he could approach a fund that says, if I got $150,000, it would help me search for a business that I can develop. Now, who runs a search fund? Search fund is an entrepreneur who has a list of, 500 doctors, high net worth professionals. And he takes this guy's request, sends it out to these guys, and these doctors who can put up $5,000 without falling over and dying if it doesn't come back. 100 of them put up $5,000. And they give this young man $150,000 to search for a business. In this particular case, this young man comes upon a family, a mom and dad operation, running a candle factory. And the guy says to this couple, illumination, the electric bulb solved this problem 100 years ago. Why are you still making candles? Besides a few churches, and when the hurricane blows past, who needs candles? You can't be. So mom and pop said, look, our parents left us this business, so we're just living on it. If we got some nice money, we would sell the thing off and move to Florida and in retirement. So the guy goes back to the fund and says, hey, I have a new business idea. It is not the illumination business. The mom and pop running it are running the illumination business, but I have a new idea. It is a mood business. He writes a business plan on how you can produce the same candle, make it smell nicer, package it more nicely, and sell it for a fancy amount of money, because you know that as Valentine's Day approaches, women lose rationality. They think of the evening with their husband, and so for a candle they will pay 20 cents for, they wouldn't know when they pay $9.99 for it, because it's a mood pack, not a candle. And these doctors put up another $10,000 or whatever together, and this guy gets $15 million, buys the factory. 2 years later, his mood business is worth $1.something billion. Each of these doctors walk away millionaires from that investment of a couple of $1,000s. When the next investment comes, even if they're going to lose the money, they won't mind putting down $50,000. These are the kind of entrepreneurial financing initiatives we need now, not what we have in banking. It's not going to finance development in Nigeria. Nigerian banking will always look.
Okay, Prof, I hear you very well about what you said about entrepreneurial financing, the need for banks to be developmental, supporting the development in the economy, and the need for a national cohesive strategy that integrates our factor endowments to be competitive globally. I hear those thoughts very well from you, and they are very, very critical at this point. So we'd like to hear from you as we begin to wrap up in terms of financing options that are available for us at this point, and also the lockdown. This is the last day of phase 2. There have been a lot of debates around managing this lockdown. Should it be extended? Should it be eased? What are your thoughts around this?
Well, as we look around the world, we see people rejigging their strategies. I realize that social distancing is still a very critical thing, because this virus can be around for 1 year, can be around for another 6 months. Who knows? Science has not caught up yet. Until a vaccine that works has been developed, we are going to be somehow with this virus. But strategies have to be modulated. What the Ghanaians, for example, have done is that they have aggressively tested and have isolated concentrations and begun to ease movements in areas where there isn't a high concentration that is more or less free. I think that we need to move to multiple strategies, but I suspect that we may yet need some extension before we are comfortable enough to do that, because we didn't begin testing early. My fear, and I have no scientific basis for this, my fear is that we have so many more infected people than our statistics from NCDC is suggesting, partly because we've not been testing as aggressively as Ghanaians have done and others have done elsewhere. So we do need a phase still of further, I don't know what I call them, lockdowns or ease downs before we begin to say, look, everybody go to work. We need to work something and manage it systematically. Otherwise, we can end up being penny-wise and pound-foolish. Okay, people can go to work, but in the end, we're all dead. The statistic of North America really comes alive in my head. I mean, it's almost incredible to think of the numbers. 99% of the population wiped out. There are also societies that have completely been wiped out by such, by the way. If you go back to Jared Diamond, who I talked about from the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, in his other book, Collapse, How Societies Have Survived and Thrived Through Human History, you will see that there are whole civilizations that don't exist anymore just because of epidemics, pandemics, and stuff like that. So we do need to be careful the choices we make. Let's give it what it takes to fight this, but let's be creative and not let economy die literally in the face of this. And there are many ways we can go about it, but the policymakers have the options between them. They know where things are concentrated. Lagos, for example, talked about aggressively testing door to door. That will give a sense for communities or parts of town that are that need more aggressive locking in or locking down, and those that could be allowed several number of hours to produce some things, and so on and so forth. So it needs an eclectic approach rather than a broad sweep of the broom.
Thank you very much, Professor Pat Utomi, for the time and for engaging us today, giving your incisive contributions on financing Nigeria's COVID-19 and the need to reposition our economy. We really appreciate having you today on the Economy and Politics Show. Thank you. And that was Professor Pat Utomi, a political economist and founder of the Centers for Values and Leadership, who was with us to discuss the financing of Nigeria's economy through COVID-19 and the need to reposition Africa's largest economy. We'll continue with the market review from 10 a.m. Stay tuned.